All right, so I'd like to demonstrate how we could create a very simple mean stack application from scratch, right? And as we mentioned earlier, mean is an acronym that from the four various technologies that make up this stack, right? There's MongoDB, that's the M. E is for Express, that's one of the more popular libraries or modules in the for Node.js that allows you to very easily create servers. A is for Angular, AngularJS. That's a very popular MVC JavaScript library. And N stands for Node.js, the server where we are hosting all this. Right now, the server is a very simple server, right? It's only really creating an instance of Express and then starting to listen for incoming requests at port 3000, or if you're hosting it at whatever port your server is running at, right? And then declaring that all public content, all static content, static from the point of view of the server, right? Static meaning this is not dynamic content that the server is generating, right? The server is sending this content verbatim, right, from the files, is sending it over to the browser. They all live in the directory public, which happens to be this public directory. Yes? So anything that you put in there is meant to be a static content. Okay? All right, so I've created a directory here called lectures, where I'm going to put some examples here that we're going to be using throughout the semester, and I'm going to be posting them online on GitHub, right? So that you can take a look at the what is that we did in class, right? So all this source code will be available to you, so that you can take a look at your own leisure. So I'm going to, under this lectures directory, I'm going to create another directory called a mean to do. Mean because it's going to be a mean stack application, and to do, we're going to create a to do list, right? The name doesn't actually matter. It's just for me to know that this is what we're building. I'm going to create an index page in here, and I'm going to put I can say hello world in there, right? The standard computer science hello world example, just to show that this is the simplest of examples that we can think of. Let's navigate there. Let's start a server. Let's start the server, and we start the server by running this server.js, right? We can say node space server.js. And we'll see that it blocks, right? It doesn't come back. It means that it's already listening at port 3000. So we can navigate to that port. We can say localhost 3000, and indeed we have this. This index page over here is this index page, right? At the top level of the public directory. Here's a public directory. At the root of that directory, we have this index page, and that's what we're seeing here. Right? Notice that I didn't specifically ask for the index page. Right, but that's what we're getting, right? The index page. This slash here is referred to as the root context, right? It's like the this physically maps to a location on the hard drive, right? In this case, it maps physically to this directory, public. Okay, so all these directories, all these files are publicly available from this. This slash over here. Everybody good? Right? Notice that if I put index or I don't put index, I still get the index page. Right? This is a standard mechanism that servers. The default behavior is that servers, if you don't ask for any file in particular, right, it will give you the default file in that directory. Right? And servers are configured to identify index.html as the default document to give you. Okay, so if you don't ask for a file, that's what they're going to give you, right? If this is a .NET or a Java or a Java server, not only do you have index.html, but or index.jsp or home.jsp. If it's a .NET, you might have index home.asp or index.asp. or if it's PHP, you might have index.php. So different servers might be configured a little bit different, right? But they all support index.html as the default page. Make sense? And notice that the name has a meaning, is that if there were no index.html, right, some servers are configured to just list the content of that directory, right? So you would see here this content, these directories. You would see them listed here by the server. Right? It says I don't have a file / maps to the public directory, so I'll show you the content of that public directory. That's a little bit of a security issue. Even though everything's public, I don't want you to consume it the way you want to consume it. I want you to consume the content the way I want you to consume the content, right? I don't just want you to be able to just peruse through my directory structure, right? So index is a way for us to provide some user interface for the user to consume the rest of the content, right? And that's what we've done here. Notice that it has some text, some whatnot, has some hyperlinks that allow me to give you access to the rest of the website, but it gives it to us in a structured way. You know, hyperlinks allow you to go to other things. Project navigates to index page on the project directory, right? I decide how you navigate through here. Make sense? All right. So in my lectures, I just created one for my to-do. So I'm going to go into my lectures. Was it lecture or lectures? Lectures / mean / to-do. There it is, the hello world, right? That hello world is that index page that we just created earlier. It's this index page, this hello world. Everybody okay? All right. Another thing that gets rendered here is the title. See the title at the top? That title comes from this element over here, saying that that's the title of the page, right? Typically, we would put here some human readable title, right? That very high level describes the content of the page. This is an HTML document, as this says, right? That means this is for the browser. The browser reads this, right, and it tries to interpret this and make sense of what you wrote here, right? And we're following a particular language called the HTML language. It is HTML5, right? Notice that it says doc type HTML. It doesn't say a version, right? That's from HTML5 on. We don't put the version, right? So we want to be able to be open, backwards compatible with older browsers, regardless of what version we think we are. Also, all HTML documents start off with an opening HTML tag. We call these tags. We also call them elements, HTML elements, right? Elements have names. The name of this particular element is the HTML. That's the name of this element. Here's another element, the head element. Notice that it highlights the opening and closing, right? Elements have an opening tag and a closing tag, okay? Notice that they're distinguished by the opening tag has no slash. See that? It just has the pointy brackets and the name, whereas the closing has a slash in front of it. See that? And notice that they're hierarchical, right? Notice that head is a parent to some child elements, right? Where meta and title are child elements of the parent head element. Make sense? So it allows us to create hierarchies, right? Kind of like this inverted tree where you have a root, right? You have branches going off to some leaves. Yes? The root is the HTML. That's the root, right? The parent of everybody else, right? In particular is the parent of two elements, the head element and the body element. Okay? The head element is meant for some meta information. Who the author is, when was this published, the title, any dependencies that this document has with other documents, right? Such as style sheets and JavaScript things, right? The second element, the body, right, is what actually gets rendered at the browser. The browser reads this and starts to look at content in here for rendering, right? And in particular, we have here an H1 element, H1, and this means that this is a header, right? It's meant to render big, right, in bold letters, right, and take up the entire width of the page. And there's several versions of these. There's H1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to H6, right? And with a decreasing size in the font size, right? So smaller headings for smaller sections. All right, great. Let's see. All right, so let's create some content in here. What we'd like to be able to do here is to create a to-do list, right? So what would we need for a to-do list? Let's have a proper title, to-do list. Okay. We would probably need something like an input field for us to type in perhaps the title of the to-do. Yes. Maybe a small text area where we can fill in the details of that to-do, and maybe a button where we can say add it to the to-do list. Yes. Right. So to do that, we can use some of the form elements of the HTML language, where we can create an input field, right? That this is meant for users to type something in there, right? If we render that, notice that it renders this very thin rectangle, right? That it's meant for us to click and start typing in there, okay? And we can type something like that. We also might want to have kind of like a label that says that this is the title. Okay, that's the title. We might want to have perhaps some kind of large text area where we can type the details. So to create a text area, we will use a text area element. Okay, if we refresh, we have a text area on the right hand side, and perhaps maybe another label, right? So maybe this is details or description, and finally maybe perhaps a button for us to click, right? To do. Okay, something like that. This is awful. It looks ugly, right? It looks very, very unprofessional. So typically what we want to do is add some style to this, right? So to make it catchy, to make it look prettier, right? And it used to be that early on when HTML just came out, HTML has, well, it still has, elements that are specific for styling purposes, right? Maybe we want to change fonts, or we want to change some underline or bold or italic or things like that, right? And HTML allowed us to do that, right? It still does, but it became such a dedicated set of skills to be able to make things look pretty that it spurred its own set of skills, right? Its own technology, right? It's such a hard thing to do to make things look pretty that today we have folks that are dedicated only to this task. You know, they're designers, right, that have more of an artistic look and feel and eye to make things look much more appealing. And there's a completely different language, you know, apart from HTML, that allow you to things make look pretty. Okay. We're going to be focusing a lot on creating applications, not much on the aesthetics of that, but nevertheless, we do want to make our things look somewhat sophisticated and polished, right? So we're going to cheat a little bit here, right? We're going to take somebody else's style sheet, right? Somebody already has spent a lot of effort to create some style sheets that we can bring to bear here. One of the style sheets that we're going to be using is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a style sheet that is very, very friendly to developers. Okay, so folks have spent quite a bit of time in creating this industry strength library, set of classes and style sheets that are very easy to bring it on board. Right. So to do that, we're going to be using this quite a lot throughout the semester. You're welcome to use other style sheets. Right. It's very common for students to use materials instead. Right. That's a very good choice. For the assignment, please stick to Bootstrap, right? For the project, feel free to use anything else, right? Or a foundation or materials. But for the assignment, just to standardize so that we can grade you much easier, right? Please stick to Bootstrap, all right? And that's what we're going to be covering in class today. I'm going to go through a lot of this. Not just yet, starting maybe next week. For now, I'm just going to bring down the style sheet. Okay, I'm going to bring the style sheet. I'm going to bring it from Bootstrap, a CDN. So a CDN is a code repository. Okay, it's a code distribution network that allows you to you find lots of the popular libraries, these very, very popular style sheets or JavaScript libraries, right? They're very, very popular, and just copy URLs, right? These are URLs. Oops, sorry. Copy, that allow you to just bring it and include it in your project, right? How do we include it? We're gonna say that we're gonna link this particular document to that other document, right? That lives elsewhere in some other server. I'm gonna say href, right? Meaning hyper reference, right? Meaning go off to some other server and download this resource, and then make this document dependent on this other resource. So there it is. Notice that it's going to go out to, it's going to use the HTTP secure protocol to talk to this other server, right? And at that server, there's a public directory. There's a public directory on that server, just like we have a public directory. That server has a public directory. And there is a directory there called Bootstrap. Under there, there's another directory called 337, and yet another directory called CSS. In that directory, there is a file called bootstrap.min.css. Okay? So just like we have a root directory and folders and files, that every server has this capability. Yes? Right? It's going to be downloaded. The browser, when it reads this, is going to not only be downloading our file, it's going to be downloading that other file too. Right? If we have references to images, it will download those images as well, right? And it will build your page based on these dependencies. Okay, so we're going to say that this is a style sheet. There we go. If we re-render now, this looks, it's a minor improvement to where we were 2 minutes ago, right? Notice that it's using a different font. It's a sans serif font, right? It doesn't have any of those curvy things. It's much easier to the human eye to read when you don't have that much information to convey the same context, right? So it's a little bit better, but we could do better, right? So let's start now that we have this library. Let's start using it, right? And to do this, we're going to declare a div. Divs allow you to structure HTML documents, break it up into rectangular areas of interest, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to say I'm embedding the content that I already have, right? I'm putting it inside of a rectangular area so that I can treat this as a block, right? I can treat it as a single entity, okay? So that if I do something to the div, it will trickle down to all its children, okay? So one of the things that I like to be able to do is to invoke some of the styles that are declared by Bootstrap, right? So Bootstrap declares tons and tons of really cool look and feel things, right? And the way we do that is by using the attribute class. So elements like div, right, or body or head or HTML have attributes, right? For instance, the link element over here has attribute href, right, and has attribute rel. See that? And notice that the HTML element also has attributes lang. Each element can have any number of attributes that configure it, right? That customize its behavior, right? From a default behavior, it customizes it and make it behave in the particular way that we want. So here we want to say that these attributes have names and values, right? The names are class, right? And then the value, we assign a value to this. The value, what class does is that it invokes some style declared by a style sheet, okay? And these styles have names, very well-known names. In particular, I'm gonna invoke the style that this is a container, right? The container style from Bootstrap does a couple of things. What it does is that if I refresh, you'll notice a difference. See that? It just moved it a little bit. Moved it a little bit to the right-hand side, right? Not much, right? But what it's doing is that before I had this as a container, notice that the content was flush with the left-hand side. See that? And that's very jarring. The human eye likes to see white spaces, right? To be able to identify borders of things that are contained within other things, right? So the white spaces are very important for the human eye, right? And you should make use of proper use of white space, right, to make things pleasing, right? Don't have things flush to one another, stuck to one another. Always have at least 5, 10, 15 pixels between elements. Okay. All right. So I did that. Another thing, I'm going to invoke yet a couple of other of these magical styling things, right? I'm going to say that this input field, again, I'm going to style this. It's like me painting with a brush, right? And picking out a color or certain things here and there, right? And so these colors, these styles have names. I'm going to say that this input field, I want to paint it. I'm going to say I'm going to use the form control, right? This is an element that it should be painted as if it were a control element, a field element in a form, right? If I do that and I refresh, notice that the input field now takes up the entire width of the page, right? And it has rounded corners. If I click on it, notice that it has this highlight. Notice that it has some padding above and below and from the left-hand side. Added some white spaces, right? All this with the class from Bootstrap, right? Bootstrap has spent quite a bit of time on this. Bootstrap is a style sheet that follows the philosophy of mobile first, right? So, for instance, it changed the width of the input field so that it takes up the entire width of the page. You see that? So that it makes it easier for us if we're looking at this on a phone for us to click on it, right? It increased the area for us to touch, right? And invoke the keyboard. We can apply the same thing with the text area. So we can go and apply the same class, just copy and paste that on the text area and refresh, same thing, right? It applies and now it takes up the entire width of the page. Notice that we have paddings on the right-hand side and paddings on the left. That's a container. The container is doing that, right? The container is adding those margins on the left-hand sides, right? Again, making good use of white spaces, right? How about that button down below, right? We have classes for those as well. We can say that we can use this BTN. BTN is a style declared by Bootstrap to make things a little prettier, right? The default rendering is so lame, right? It looks really, really ugly. But just with that button, if I refresh, it just looks a little bit better, right? Some more padding, some rounded corners, so that it follows the same look and feel all throughout, right? Everything's rounded corners everywhere, right? But it's using the default color of gray. We can change that. Bootstrap provides some standard palettes, right? Color palettes, and it uses some semantic names that are somewhat high level, like primary, danger, info, alerts, right? These are all semantic meanings that mean something to us, and uses Western culture on assigning certain colors to certain meanings, right? So danger is red, right? Successful is green, right? So there's some meanings there that are culturally based, right? So for instance, we could say, I don't want just plain button. I want button, and I want this to be success. Success in our culture presumably success is green. I don't know if it means because green means go, continue, you can keep going, or does it mean green because the dollar is green, success with money green? I don't know. But nevertheless, in this culture, green is success. We can keep going. There's a couple things that you can add. We can change. We can say, oops, sorry. If you say danger, right? Again, it's red, right? Notice that it's not using primary colors. It's kind of using some offset, some secondary colors there as well. So I'm going to stick to success or primary. Primary is the kind of like the default bluish color from the color palette of Bootstrap. Some more couple of things. Notice by default is deciding that this button is not taking up the entire width of the page, right? When we render content, the browser follows certain rules on how to render things, right? The rules are at a wide and a broad sense follow two policies, right? Very, very broad policies. One of them is that an element will either be considered a block element or an inline element. Okay. Notice that the default behavior was to put together or render things from left to right. Right. Again, Western culture. Read from left to right, from top to bottom. Was to put the title, the input field, the text area, the button all inline, one after another, right? Up until there was no more space on the right-hand side, it would wrap and then it would continue, right? So by default, was rendering all these elements as inlines. That's the inline policy, right? Render from top to bottom, from left to right. When there's no more space, wrap, right? That's the inline policy. Yes. The block policy is that I will take up as much space as I have, right? And once I don't have any more space, I'll add vertical spacing, right? So for instance, the header is using block policy, right? It's rendering the to-do list. It's taking up the entire width of the page, and it added a new line. See that? And notice that we changed the input field. We changed it from inline policy. It was changed to a block policy, right? We could do that. We did that by adding the class form control. Form control does that, right? It says it changes the policy from inline to block. But notice that the button is not taking up the entire width of the page, right? By default it stays, even though we added BTN and BTN primary, it stays with inline, right? It doesn't take up the entire width of the page, right? But we can, and that was a design decision by the team, by the Bootstrap team. They were thinking maybe you want to put many buttons one after another, right? And right next to each other, as opposed to taking up, vertically. Yes, but we have leeway. We can change behaviors as we want by adding new classes. We can say BTN block, right? I want to override the default to be a block instead, right? So now the button behaves in a block rendering. Everybody okay? All right. So we have this. So let's change this. Maybe this is to-do form, and down below we might have the actual to-do list, right? So down below we might have the list of all to-dos, right? And the list might be something like H3 might have pick up kids, right? And some description, some paragraph. P is a paragraph, and we might have some description, some notes. Maybe not description, maybe notes. Notes, that's better. And the notes might be, since I can't think of anything here, I'm gonna go look up for some content to fill in here, right? It happens to us quite a bit. We are developers. We are, and we want to look see what the page would look like if there were content, right? So let's look for some dummy content. We'll do that by going to lorem ipsum. So lorem ipsum is dummy content that is based on some Greek passages of some famous books from antiquity. That is not meant to mean anything, right? Although the original text did mean something. It's from a real book, but it's meant for us Westerners, right? To just look at content, right? It doesn't really matter if we could read it or not, right? It's used quite widely in the printing industry, right? In a newspaper industry, in the magazines, where you have editors, they're creating their content, and you have then the folks that are laying out the page, right? And they're laying out titles and content. They don't have the content yet because somebody's writing it, right? But I need to know what it's going to look like, right? So they use this dummy content to put in there. We're going to do the same thing. So let's grab some passages from here, and we'll go here and paste it in there, right? So if I go there and re-render, down below we have the to-do list, pickup kits, and some blurbs down below. Yes, right? Okay, and a couple other things. They might have several of these, right? To do entries. So make dinner. Okay, you might have several to-dos. There it is. Make dinner. Music lessons, right, and dance lessons. There we go. So we have all the to-dos on the bottom, right? So we have the beginnings of what a page might look like. Everybody okay? All right. We want to make this dynamic. Right now, it's a static page. Right. Right now, it's a static page. Not very interesting. We knew how to do this already. We didn't need this class for this, right? So we want to do this dynamically, right? We want to render this dynamically. Okay. So to do that, we're gonna make use of the Angular as a model view controller library, JavaScript library. So to do that, we're gonna have to install Angular on our page, right? So to do that, I'm gonna go again to a CDN, just like I went to a CDN for Bootstrap. I'm gonna go to a CDN also for Angular. Using CDN content is preferable because these CDNs, they have made an effort at being popular at what they do, right? Distributing code. And many of the popular websites like Facebook and Google and Twitter and all these websites, they use CDNs, right? And they're definitely more popular than we are, right? And it's a good chance that before coming to our website, they have gone to these other websites first, yes? So they might have already downloaded, their browsers might have already downloaded Bootstrap and Angular and React and all these libraries. So the browser is caching all this content already, right? And browsers are smart. Next time they see another page that wants to download the exact same CSS or same exact JavaScript, they'll say, oh, I have that one already. I'm not going to bother fetching it again, right? I already have it stored in the machine, right? So using a CDN, right, somebody else's server, right, it actually increases your performance, right, of your page, right? Unless you become Google or become Twitter or Amazon, right? Then you might think of other ways to optimize, right? Because now you're competing with equally popular websites, right? But you being alone with your own little content is better to use CDNs, right? All right, so let's go and fetch some content in a CDN for Angular. So Angular CDN. Let's fetch it from the owners of Angular, Google themselves. Okay, they have their own CDNs where they host all sorts of things, not only AngularJS. And we're gonna just do a copy here, and we're just gonna paste it in there. I'm gonna paste it. There we go. We download. We are connecting again to some other server on the network, following some directory structure, and we're downloading this Angular min.js. Why? What is this min? What is all this min? If you look at the if we refresh the page and we inspect, notice that I'm right-clicking and inspecting. Okay, this inspect, it brings up a panel on the right-hand side. Right, this is going to be your best new friend. Okay, for the rest of the semester, you're going to be using extensive use of this inspect tool on the right-hand side. Okay, first of all, notice that it has at the beginning it has several tabs over here, right? So it has elements as default tab, and what it has the DOM is here. This is the DOM. This is the mental model that the browser has of your page, right? Your browser has downloaded this ASCII file, yes? It parsed it, and it tried to make sense out of it, okay? And this is its interpretation. This is what I understood when it created this object hierarchy on the right-hand side. It's understanding that, yes, you have an HTML element. I saw that. Very good. I saw that you have a head element. I see that you have a body element. And notice that as I hover on the right-hand side, it highlights stuff on the left-hand side, right? And says that this DOM element right here corresponds to that thing that I'm highlighting on the left-hand side. And you're going to be using this a lot in the semester. If I highlight this div, notice that it changes color, right? It has like a greenish to highlight that these are margins, right? These are margins, and that the content actually is inside of in the bluish area, right? But there are margins that go left and right. Notice that on the over here we see what they are. See the margins, right? And the padding right, padding left of 15 pixels, and it also highlights it over here as green, as that being the padding or the content in bluish area. So this is very, very useful. Designers use this a lot. When they look at actual content, they might make some tweaks using this tool. Once they're happy with those tweaks, they copy them and then they paste them and make them permanent in a style sheet, right? But this is a very great tool to see what's going on, why things are not laying out the way you thought they were going to be laying it out. All right, always use this as a debugging tool. Great. It also provides some console where you can print out values, all the logic. You can put logic in JavaScript, and you can print out some content to see maybe responses from a server. You can see all sorts of things. Don't use the console. No, actually, you do use the console. But what I really want you to be able to use is sources. Sources over here. Sources allows you to do a lot of debugging, right? And I want you to learn and practice on how to do debugging on your own, right? So this is where I want you to spend most of your time. On the source, looking at sources. Anyway, so this one shows all the things that were downloaded. Notice that these are things that were downloaded from Bootstrap CDN. These are the things that were downloaded from Angular from Google. These are the files that were downloaded. If you click on the files that were downloaded, so Bootstrap, you'll see that it's a huge file, but a single line. Okay, you see that it's a single line, right? What happens here is that the original file is this one. This is the original file, right? It's nicely with indentation and new lines, right? It's easier for human beings to read this, right? But browsers don't really care what humans like to read, right? Instead, we provide a minified version of the files, right? And the idea is to remove any unnecessary content, right, to reduce the size of the file and make sure that it downloads as fast as possible. Okay, so it goes typically when we put things in production, right, we want to reduce as much as possible the time for downloading all these libraries, right? Angular min is also, notice that it's gibberish. You know, it's not meant for human consumption, right? Yes. I'm sorry? Locally? Yes, yeah, that's a good point. When you publish something in production, is a good idea to use all minified versions, right? Now, for development purposes, it's oftentimes best to have the unminified version, right? The original version, right? First of all, the IDE parses these files, right? And it's useful to do autocomplete, for instance, right? As you type, right? For instance, notice that mine, as I typed, and I type container. Notice that it's not doing any autocomplete. It's not doing any autocomplete. If I had Bootstrap CSS, the original file, installed locally, copied here on my machine, the IDE would have parsed it. Yes. And as I typed, it would have given me all sorts of options for me to. So for development purposes, right, it's best to have a copy, right? Also because you might be coding on the train or the subway, and you don't have network connection, and you can't download these things, right? You might not have a network for development purposes. So when typically the deploy part of a production environment goes through this transformation, right? It minifies everything, it reduces everything to small, it takes all the JavaScripts. You might have hundreds of JavaScript files, what it'll do is we'll concatenate all the JavaScript into a single JavaScript file, right? It will reduce the names of your variables. You had all these really nice variable names, right? It will reduce them to just A, B's, and C's, right? Again, to reduce, not the equivalent reduction will be the equivalent to what it were originally. Should behave the same way, right? The problem is that concatenating files that were not originally in the same file, that has consequences, right? So oftentimes you have to code knowing that at some point your code will go through a minification process, all right? That will impact how your code will behave, right? So we'll talk about those things when we go a little further. But yes, thank you. All right, so we have Angular. All right, so what we're going to do is notice that this hasn't changed a bit, right? So we refresh the console, the same. We're going to declare here this to be an Angular application. Okay. What this library does, this Angular library does, is that it declares a object. It declares a global variable, right, called Angular. Right? It does something that we're going to teach you not to do. Okay? We're going to teach you not to declare global variables. Right? It's bad practice. Only when you get as big as Google or jQuery or Facebook, okay, you can then claim that it's a good idea to declare a global variable. Okay? Angular has become so popular, right? And it's that it can claim that name. Right? I claim Google has declared that it owns the name Angular. Okay, and it can take those kinds of steps. We're going to teach you not to do that, right? Unless, again, if you create a very popular library tomorrow, right, and you put it in open source, and people start thinking that your library is the greatest, okay, you might take that step, right? And says, okay, I'll declare this to be a global object. Anyway, it also declares, Angular allows you to redeclare the entire HTML language. You don't like the HTML language, the way it behaves, you can change it to behave any which way you want. All right? In particular, it declares attributes of its own. Right? Just like we have all these attributes, src, href, lang, those are all standard attributes of the HTML language. Right? The browser knows what to do with them. Right? It interprets them and it does things. Angular declares its own set of attributes. Okay? That the browser has no idea what to do with them. Right? They're not meant for the browser. They're not meant for the browser. They're meant to be interpreted by the Angular infrastructure. Okay? We're going to introduce you with the very first of these attributes, ng app. ng app to do app. Okay? This attribute is not a standard HTML attribute. The browser is going to ignore it. It says, I have no idea what this attribute does. Instead, it's going to be interpreted by the Angular infrastructure. What does it do? It declares this as a application, an Angular application. Right? Notice that Google has been nice enough to namespace their attributes. Right? It puts an ng dash in front of this. Right? So that there is no misunderstanding that this attribute is not a standard attribute. It's declared by the Angular infrastructure. Make sense? And that's a good practice, right? When we get to directives and we start creating our own attributes, we should also follow this practice of namespacing our own, right? If you work for a company, right, perhaps you'll use the acronyms of that company, or that company might have a naming convention on how you name things, right? And you'll follow those policies. Very good. If I refresh my page, it complains. It says, okay, you declare this to be a to-do app, right? That's the name of the application. This has to match with some declaration of some application that is called to-do app. I can't find it. Where is it? It's not declared anywhere. Okay? we need to declare the application and configure it. To do that, we're going to create a separate script of our own. Right? We're going to create our own app.js. Okay. Notice that it's src says that the source of this file is called app.js. Notice it has no directories in front of it, right? That means that presumably this app.js exists at the same location where this index file is. That's where it's going to look for it. Okay? Wherever the index file is, there should also be an app.js. So my index file is right here, and we're going to create a JavaScript called app.js. Everybody good? Okay? All right. Okay, so in here, we're going to make use of that Angular variable that the Angular infrastructure makes available at the global space, right? And that's where is that declared? It's declared right here, right? This is this JavaScript declares that. So right after that, I'm going to use that variable that was declared in the previous JavaScript library. Yes, I'm going to say Angular. It's global, right? I can just name it use it by name. And this Angular, if I do console log is a function that is native to the JavaScript language, right? That it's interpreted by the browser to print things at the console. Remember the console over here, the browser right here, this console, it would print it right here. Yes? So if I and whatever I give it, right? If I say hello world, it prints out hello world. So there's my hello world, right? And then the complaint, right? So we can print out what the Angular object is. We can print it out. There it is. It's an object, okay? And it has all sorts of things in there, right? Tons and tons of functions, right? That are in that object. In particular, we're going to be interested in one. The module function right here, module right there, right? The module will allow us to build applications, right? Or break up large applications into smaller applications. Yes? So we're going to declare one module, and we're going to call it Angular.module. We're going to give it the same name as the declaration of this ng app. Right? This ng app is going to look for a module of that name. Okay, so there it is. And we're also going to say that this module is a top-level module, right? That might depend on other modules, right? You could break it up into many different modules, just like you would in Java using import or include or whatever other mechanisms that allow you to break it up into packages, right? The module is like the equivalent of a package in Java or C#. Yes? Right? And then you can break it up into many different packages. Yes? No. This particular module is a top-level module. It doesn't depend on any other module. This is what this says. Here, if this module depended on other things, you would list them here as an array. But we have no dependencies. Okay, if I refresh, notice that it doesn't complain anymore. It found it. I found the module. Okay, this is the simplest of Angular applications. Right? So simple that it doesn't do anything. Right? To make it do a couple of things, we need to start having interact perhaps with the client. Yes. Yeah, that means you can pass arguments to it, right? It shows the different arguments that you can pass. No, in Java you can. So JavaScript doesn't force you to pass all the arguments. You could call this with no arguments, right? You could call this one an argument. It would not complain, right? So JavaScript, a function can declare any number of parameters, right? But when you call the function, you're not compelled to pass all the arguments. You can pass only the first two, the first three, okay? And that would be okay. All the other ones would be undefined. All would be local variables, undefined local variables. Yep. All right, so to make this interesting, we need to tie this user interface somehow with the application, right? And the bridge between these two worlds, right, happens by following the model view controller structure, right, or design pattern that Angular forces us into. Okay, Angular says that this HTML over here, this HTML, it's going to go in the bucket of the view, right? If anything that is meant for rendering or displaying for the human being, right, is considered to be a view, right? And certainly this page is falls in that bucket, right? But views have no data themselves, right? Somebody has to provide the data for the view for rendering. Right now there is no data; everything's hard-coded, but we want to make it dynamic. If it's dynamic, that means that somebody has to give it data, dynamic data, that needs to be dynamically rendered. Yes? The data needs to be provided by a controller, right? A controller, model view controller, MVC, right? Has these three buckets, right? And they all have very well-defined roles to play. Okay, views themselves don't have any data. It is provided by a controller, right? The controller role is to receive events from the view as users click and drag and interact and fill in forms, right? And interact with the user interface, right? And then depending on those actions of adding, deleting, removing, changing, updating, yes, it's responsible for talking to the M in MVC, right? Changing the data, right? Either removing things from the data or updating things in the data, right? And then getting the resulting data back to the view for rendering, right? So you have this triangle, right, of the view generating events for the controller updating the model, and then passing data back to the view for rendering, right? That goes back and forth. So let's do that. So we need to tie this view to a controller, which will be responsible for the data that we're gonna render. To do that, there is another ng controller attribute that says this view is the responsibility of this particular controller. Okay, you can have many different views, right? And each view can be tied to different controllers, right? That could be independent on each other. You can have hierarchies of control, like a top-level controller, right, like an application controller, and then subsets of smaller controllers that have a more narrow scope of interest, right? Here we're going to have just one single controller, one single view for now, right? We'll call it the to-do controller. Okay, so if I render, notice that it complains again. It complains again. It says, well, I'm referencing this controller, but I can't find it. Nobody declared it. Right? It's not declared anywhere. Right? I'm trying to tie this view with a controller, and I can't find it. Okay, if I click on it, I notice that it brings me back to Angular, that it gives me a little more context on what the error is. Right? It says that I was looking for to-do controller, but I can't find the function declared anywhere. Okay, so let's try to fix that. To do that, we're going to go back to our app.js, right? And in addition to module as a function, we also have other functions in there, such as controller. Controller is another function, okay, that allows us to declare controllers. Yes? So let's declare that controller that we declared earlier, to-do controller, right? And we're going to implement it in a function of the same name. They don't have to have the same name, right? The name that I give it over here declares it in the infrastructure, right? In my application, I'm saying application to-do app has a controller called to-do controller, in that only available in that application, right? Or in the context of that application. And it's implemented in this function called to-do controller. Okay, the name of the controller can be called something else, right? It doesn't have to be called. I use the same name only to keep it straight in my head. Yes.
What if we have like put controllers in the one?
Yeah, you can have as many as you want, and we'll have plenty.
So we just chain it.
Yeah, chain it. You can chain it. This is a very common technique in JavaScript, right? You can have any number of controllers right in here. Yep. And the first assignment asks you to do that. Yep. So this function, oops, to-do controller, right, is going to be treated as a constructor. Okay, in JavaScript, functions can be treated as constructors, right, to create an instance, right, of an object. So this will be treated as a constructor. Will create an instance of the controller, and then it will tie the infrastructure. Will tie the view with that controller. So if I say here console log hello from to-do controller, right, and I refresh, notice it says hello from to-do controller, right? So it is going in there, instantiating and running whatever's in that function. Everybody good? And it's not complaining. So let's send some data. What we want to be able to do is have the controller send data to the view for rendering, right? So let's do that. To do that, we use what it's called a scope. The scope is a variable. It's a magic variable, right, that is declared by the infrastructure, right, and it gets passed to us whenever we ask for it by name. And it has to have exactly that name, $scope, right? And as we'll see a little later, is that we're going to say that this scope is being injected into the controller, but copying some of the ideas from more mature technologies such as Java and .NET, right? Injection and inversion of control are very common mechanisms for sharing services across the infrastructure, right? Angular uses that idea, right, for this. But for now, let's say it's a magical object that gets passed to us when we ask for it by name, right? And if you've used .NET or JSPs or ASPs, those infrastructures are also full of these magical variables, right? Session, right? Application, page, right? Those infrastructures also have these magical variables. All right. So what scope does, as the name suggests, is that it allows us to talk to the scope or our particular place in the page that we are responsible for, right? The controller is responsible for all the content within this div, right? But it has no jurisdiction outside of the div, right? It only can do things and manipulate this div, right? So we say that the scope of this controller is this div, right? And it has access to its scope through the variable scope. Very good. It can send data to the view by declaring values or variables on the scope. Hello world. Okay. Oops, sorry. Declaring, and then the view or inside of my HTML, anything that the controller declares on the scope is readily available here on the view. Okay. And vice versa. Whatever the view declares is also available on the controller. It is a two-way binding. And the way we refer to it is by name. Right? We say hello. We can just refer to it by name. Hello. That's not quite what we were expecting, right? Notice that this hello, these characters are being interpreted by who? The browser is interpreting this hello, right, as a plain ASCII, right? And it's rendering the hello. Instead, we want this variable to be interpreted. We want this ASCII to be interpreted as a variable, right? Not as a literal string. Yes. To do that, we need to say, I want to leave the HTML world. I want to jump into the Angular world for a minute, right? And then come back to the HTML world, right? So the way we do that is we use escape characters. We say, I'm going to escape into the Angular world for a second. Right? I'm going to interpret this hello as a variable. And then I want to go back to the HTML world. Okay? Right? Meaning I want to treat this as a template, right? Something that's going to be filled in. If I refresh, notice that it says hello world, right? That's what the controller says. The controller put a value on this hello variable, and now it's being interpreted. So HTML is now interpreting this. JavaScript is interpreting this, right, as a variable. Everybody okay? All right. Let's make this a little more interesting. Instead of just a string, we'll say to-dos, and we'll put an array. We'll put an array of objects, right, that will have titles, right? And some of the titles I'm going to pick out, I'm just going to say to do 1, and then a note, and then this is note 1. Okay, I'm doing it really quick because we're almost running out of time. I'm just going to copy a couple of these, right? Note 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right? So if I render here, notice that my hello is gone, right? Because the scope is no longer declaring the hello variable. Instead, it's declaring a to-dos variable, right? So I could replace this and say to-dos. If I render it, notice that I have, on the HTML, I do have the data down, right? It doesn't know what to do with it, right? It's just rendering it as raw JSON, right? As an object, it's rendering as an object. We don't really want to do this. What do we want to do? We want to iterate over this array, right? We're going to call it like a for loop, right? And as we iterate over each one of these objects, we want to dynamically update this down below, right? So let's do that. Instead of rendering like this, what we want to do is take this as a template, right? Us developers, we love to find patterns. And that's a pattern, right? That repeats. H3, a paragraph, H3, a paragraph, H3, a paragraph, right? We love to automate things like that. We don't want to do things manually. Instead, we find patterns and we automate them, right? So this H3, right? What we're going to do is we're going to create a block of HTML, right? We're going to treat each node as a single block, right? And what we want to do is we're going to copy and paste this block over and over and over as many objects as there are in the array. Yes? Right? We want to copy this. So the way we do that, we can use yet another ng attribute called the ng repeat, meaning repeat this content, right? As long as there are elements in this array, right? We can say ng repeat as long as there are to do in the to-dos. Okay, where's to-dos? What's this? That's the array that was declared in the scope, right? And each to-do, as this gets copied and pasted over and over, is going to be bound to each one of the instances of these objects. First it'll be this one, then it'll be that one, then this one, then that one, and so on and so forth. Everybody okay? Right? So if I go back and I re-render this, notice what's happening here. Oops. Right, that pick up the kids is being copied and pasted over and over and over 6 times. See that? Right, because that's exactly what we told it to do. Do this 6 times, right? As many as there are objects. But we're copying something that is static over and over and over. Instead, what we want to do is that this pick up the kids, what we want to do is refer to the local variable that we just created here to do. That's a local variable that is inside of a loop, right? And it has an attribute title and it has a note attribute. See that? Right? So I want here to look at the to-do.title and this over here, right, to be to-do dot note. Okay? See that? If I refresh this, notice that we have the to-do 1, note 1, to-do 2, note 2, to-do 3, note 3. Right? This was dynamically generated, right, by iterating over a collection. Now, obviously, we have this hard-coded. This array is currently hard-coded, but as we progress, when we meet next time, we'll show you how that this data actually can be retrieved from a server from data that is stored in some MongoDB set of records. Yes?
Can you please explain this module part, just like you explained the controller? So what I am able to see that you declared controller in the HTML and this function is doing something.
Yes.
So I'm not able to get, we are just declaring that module into the HTML and declaring here.
Yes.
What's the use of it? It's just like matching two things. It's not doing any functionality.
Yeah, so what happens is that just like these ng app and ng controller, they are tied to some JavaScript code, right? And in here as well, we're going to do the same thing. We are using some name, right? We're associating this name to something that gets instantiated elsewhere in some JavaScript. It's the tie of saying that This HTML responsibility is this controller. The controller has the responsibility of this div, right? And you can have any number of snippets.
Yeah, but controller part, I get it. Like it's tied to this JavaScript.
Yes.
But for the module part, it's just declared that nothing is happening for the module part. Angular.module.
Right. The module creates the context, right? Everything has to be declared in some context, right? So you cannot declare a controller outside of the context of an application, right? So all the directives and controllers and services and whatnot will be within the context of an application.
So the module is just for declaring the context?
Yes. Yeah, the application. Yep. Which we'll see later that you can create any number of contexts that can then share amongst themselves, right? So you can break it up into smaller modules, and the top level module can then load directives from here, controllers from there, can load all things. It's the way you do in Java, right? You create packages, right? And then each package has its own name at the top, package, blah, 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 blah. And then when you do an import, you import using the names of those packages. Same thing here. Yes? Somebody have a question? Oh.
So can you show an example of how you can have multiple modules? For example, for this one, you made the top level.
Not today, but we will a little later.
So
Yeah, I think we're
just to get
out
an
of time.
idea, can you do it for a div as well, or just
For
an
what?
HTML? Can you declare a module for a top level HTML only, or
Yeah.
can you do it for a div as well?
for I don't understand the last.
For a div.
Oh, for a div. Yeah, you can have different modules declare for different ones. ng app is only one. Right? ng app is only one. So that would be a top level module, which can then use many other modules, right? That can load, and you would break it up. For instance, directives is a very common thing that you would put all the directives inside of a module, and then that module can then be loaded by any other module that wants to use all those directives. Right? It's a very common way of distributing open source code, right? As inside of a module. Anybody wants to use the functionality would declare that module as a dependency of the top level module. Yeah, and we'll see. We'll do that. We'll do that. All right. All right. I think we're all set. See you next Tuesday, right? Tuesdays and Fridays. Please work on having the server, presumably Heroku or Mongo MLab, all ready for next Tuesday. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Do we have to do project individually, or we can do that in pairs?
You could take it. You can do it in pairs.
Okay. Thank you.